What would you do if the entire world demanded justice, and the person standing in the center of the storm was your own brother? That's the uncomfortable, heartbreaking, almost unthinkable question that King Charles III has been forced to confront. Because this isn't just a royal scandal. This isn't just a PR disaster or a newspaper headline. This is the kind of crisis that shakes a monarchy to its foundations. And tonight, we're diving into the moment King Charles crossed a line no British monarch has crossed in modern history, stripping his disgraced brother, Prince Andrew, of his royal titles and evicting him from Royal Lodge, the home Andrew has guarded with a sense of entitlement that shocked even those closest to him. But that wasn't the end, because what came next was something no one saw coming. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor has now been arrested. And the story behind how we arrived here is darker, deeper, and far more complicated than you've been told. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. So let me ask you this. How does a man go from being ninth in line to the throne, a war veteran, a senior royal, a representative of the crown itself, to becoming a liability so radioactive that the King of England had no choice but to cut him out for the survival of the entire institution? And more importantly, why did all of this erupt now? Why this week, this moment, this sudden shift from quiet palace whispers to decisive royal action? Because behind the scenes, away from the photo ops and carefully phrased press releases, something extraordinary has been unfolding inside Buckingham Palace. Something intense, something emotional, something explosive. Picture this. It's a gray London morning. The kind of cold, damp hush that feels like a warning. Inside Buckingham Palace, an emergency meeting has been called. The kind of meeting where aides walk faster, voices stay low, and every door closes with a heavy, deliberate click. For weeks, maybe months, pressure has been building. Political pressure, public pressure, international pressure, pressure from military organizations, pressure from charities, pressure from within the royal family itself. Because everyone knew that the Epstein story wasn't going away. Everyone knew that Andrew's connections weren't just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. And yet Charles hesitated. Why? Why would a monarch known for pragmatism and discipline hold off when the entire nation was watching? Let's be honest, family is messy. Family is emotional. And family loyalty, especially royal family loyalty, has historically covered up a lot of pain. But this time, this was different. This wasn't a matter of protecting a reputation. This was a matter of protecting a country, protecting a monarchy, protecting a legacy that goes back more than 1,000 years. And for Charles, the story didn't start with Andrew's infamous Newsnight interview. It didn't start with the lawsuits, the statements, or the denials. It didn't even start with Epstein. It started long before any of that, with years of behavior that many inside the palace quietly warned would one day lead to catastrophe. But here's where things get even stranger. Even as Charles struggled with the weight of the decision, another force was moving behind the scenes, something he didn't expect, something he couldn't predict, something that would force his hand faster than anyone anticipated. And this is the part the public hasn't heard yet. Because while newspapers focused on the optics of Andrew refusing to leave Royal Lodge, while headlines screamed about taxpayer-funded security and royal privileges, something else was happening. Pressure from beyond Britain's borders. Questions from investigators in multiple countries. Requests from intelligence agencies. Suddenly, it didn't matter what Charles wanted. It didn't matter what the palace wanted. Events were spiraling beyond royal control. Now imagine being King Charles in that moment. Imagine looking at your advisors, seasoned professionals who've seen everything from Diana's death to palace break-ins, and realizing that even they look frightened. Imagine knowing that if you hesitate, even for a second, the monarchy itself could be accused of obstruction, secrecy, or worse. And imagine doing all of this while cameras flash, while tabloids feast, while your family fractures behind the scenes, and while every decision you make becomes a permanent piece of history. But let's slow down for a second. Because before we reach the arrest, before Andrew was escorted away in that quiet, controlled, almost surreal operation, we have to go back. We have to understand how this scandal went from a slow-burning embarrassment to a full-blown royal crisis. We must revisit the moments that built the tension, the mistakes that compounded it, the secrets that fueled it, and the breaking point that forced King Charles to take a step that no brother ever wants to take. And here's something the media won't tell you. Charles didn't wake up one morning and decide to make an example out of Andrew. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about public pressure alone. This was about something far more personal and far more devastating. Because when the stakes are this high, when the crown is on the line, when the family legacy itself is trembling, leaders don't act based on emotion. They act based on fear. The fear of losing control. The fear of letting a scandal dictate the monarchy's future. The fear that if they don't act decisively, someone else will act for them. Let me ask you something directly. Have you ever watched someone refuse to take responsibility, even as their world collapses around them? That's exactly what was happening inside Royal Lodge. Because while the public imagined Andrew sitting quietly in shame or reflection, insiders tell a very different story. A story of a man who still believed he was untouchable, who believed he deserved his home, his titles, his privileges, his status, even after the world had turned against him. And that refusal to leave, that stubbornness, that insistence on holding on to a life that no longer existed, that was the moment everything shifted. You see, there's a certain irony here. Andrew's downfall didn't accelerate because of the crimes of Epstein. It accelerated because Andrew refused to accept reality. And that refusal, that inability to see how dangerous the situation had become, is part of what made the final decision so heartbreaking for Charles. Because at some point, even the most loyal family members have to confront the truth. You cannot save someone who doesn't want to be saved. And yet, something else was happening behind the scenes. Something only a handful of people knew. Because the day before Andrew's arrest, the king was given information that changed everything. The kind of information that leaves a room silent. The kind of information that forces even the most powerful people in the world to rethink their entire strategy. And the moment that information landed, whether it was a document, a briefing, a private testimony, that was when Charles realized his hands were tied. So here's what this video will explore: the emotional battle between two brothers, the internal struggle inside Buckingham Palace, the international involvement no one expected, and the chain of events that led to the moment where King Charles faced the hardest decision of his reign, and Andrew faced the consequences he spent years avoiding. Because this isn't just a scandal. This is a turning point. The kind of turning point historians write about. The kind of turning point old institutions either survive or collapse under. And whether you support the monarchy or not, whether you sympathize with Charles or feel he acted too late, one thing is undeniable. We are witnessing history unfold in real time. But here's the question I want you to sit with as we move deeper into this story. What exactly pushed Charles over the edge? Was it public pressure? Political pressure? A personal betrayal? Or was it something far more unexpected, something that forced his hand in a way no one ever imagined? Because what happened the night before Andrew's arrest wasn't just dramatic. It wasn't just shocking. It was the moment that made King Charles realize he had no choice. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the first crack in the royal armor wasn't a headline, but a whisper? What if the moment this entire royal catastrophe began wasn't on camera, wasn't in a courtroom, wasn't even in a palace meeting, but in a quiet hallway at Balmoral, where a single comment passed between two senior aides sent a chill through the room? Because that's exactly how it started. Not with a scandal splashed on the front pages, but with a subtle shift in tone, a shift so slight most people would have missed it. But inside the royal household, where whispers can mean revolutions, that shift meant the fall had already begun. And the question I want to ask you is simple. How many warnings does a family ignore before the consequences finally arrive? It was late summer, the kind of crisp Scottish air that usually brings a sense of calm. Balmoral Castle, with its endless forests and quiet lakes, has always been the royal family's refuge, the place they go to exhale when the world becomes too loud. But this time, the silence felt suffocating. Because Andrew had arrived with attention clinging to him like mist, and even those who had known him his entire life felt something unsettling. Not guilt, not remorse, something worse, a sort of restless entitlement, an almost defiant refusal to acknowledge the gravity of what he'd become. The staff noticed it first. They always do. They noticed the clipped tone, the bursts of irritation, the way Andrew paced the corridors late at night. They noticed how he avoided eye contact with certain family members. They noticed how his presence made the atmosphere feel heavier, as if even the castle itself was tired of carrying his secrets. One aide, a veteran of both the Diana years and the explosive fallout of the Newsnight interview, described it as walking on eggshells while waiting for a bomb to go off. And that's the thing. When someone is spiraling, the room feels it long before the person does. You know that feeling, right? When you sense a storm even before the first dark cloud appears. That's what Balmoral felt like. A storm forming quietly, but unavoidably. But here's the contradiction that made everything worse. Andrew genuinely believed he was still protected, still insulated, still immune. He walked the halls with a kind of stubborn confidence, as if the walls themselves owed him unwavering safety. And that contradiction, his entitlement versus the world's growing impatience, is where the fall truly began. Because while most people in his situation would have gone silent, gone humble, gone reflective, Andrew went the opposite direction. More defiant, more demanding, more determined to cling to the status he no longer had. And that defiance didn't just frustrate the staff. It alarmed them. But the real shift happened during a private dinner attended only by immediate family: Charles, Camilla, William, and Andrew. The kind of dinner where the air is so thick with unresolved history, you could almost cut it with a knife. At first, it was the usual royal small talk. Formal, polite, emotionally distant. But halfway through, Andrew made a remark. A single sentence. Something about how the public would eventually understand, followed by a suggestion that perhaps the palace had mishandled the narrative. That one comment changed the temperature of the room instantly. Camilla's fork paused midair. William leaned back, arms crossed. Charles stared down at his plate, jaw tightening. Because for Andrew to make that comment, there, in front of the future King of England, was more than denial. It was delusion. And in that moment, Charles saw something that terrified him. Andrew had not learned anything. Not a single thing. No introspection. No accountability. No understanding of how deep the damage went. And how dangerous that blindness could become. Let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone refuse to accept that their actions have consequences? Someone who builds a wall of excuses so tall they can no longer see reality on the other side? That's what Charles was looking at. A brother so disconnected from the consequences of his own choices that he had become a liability to everyone around him. And for a king, a liability is far more than a nuisance. It's a threat. But here's the twist. Even after that explosive dinner, Charles didn't act. Not yet. Because despite everything, the outrage, the pressure, the warnings, Charles was still a brother before he was a king. That's the emotional contradiction at the heart of this story. Duty versus family, crown versus blood, justice versus loyalty. And for Charles, that contradiction had been tearing him apart for months. But if the family dinner was the spark, the real ignition happened 2 days later. A senior royal aide. Someone deeply trusted, someone who never exaggerates, someone who's been in the palace for decades, approached Charles with a whispered warning. Your Majesty, there is something you need to see. The aide's face was pale. His voice was low. And for a man who had lived through nearly every royal crisis of the last 40 years, that meant everything. Charles followed him to a small, rarely used study. On the desk sat a manila folder, the kind that usually holds briefing notes or travel plans. But this one was different. It was thicker, heavier, labeled with a red stamp. Internal, sensitive. Charles opened it. The first page was a summary. By the second page, his expression changed. By the third, his breathing did. Because the folder contained something he had not expected. A timeline. A pattern. A set of events and communications involving Andrew that had remained hidden until now. Short sentences for impact. It wasn't just embarrassing. It wasn't just irresponsible. It was dangerous. And if the information inside that folder ever became public, it wouldn't just be Andrew who suffered. The monarchy would. The government would. Britain's international credibility would. Charles set the folder down. He rubbed his temples. He whispered something under his breath, something the aide later recalled as, "How did it come to this?" But it wasn't the contents of the folder alone that marked the beginning of the end. It was what was attached to the very last page. A single note. A note written by someone Charles trusted implicitly. A note warning him that matters were escalating faster than the palace had anticipated. A note urging immediate action. And when Charles read the signature at the bottom, his stomach clenched. Because it wasn't from a palace aide. It wasn't from a lawyer. It wasn't from a government official. It was from someone much closer. And that signature, that one name, was the moment King Charles realized that the situation was far worse than he had imagined. Here's my question for you. What kind of information would force the King of England to take decisive action against his own brother? What kind of revelation could make him abandon caution, tradition, and decades of family loyalty in a single moment? Because that's exactly what happened. And it was only the beginning. But the most chilling part, the part no one inside the palace could ignore, came next. Because just when Charles thought he understood the scale of the problem, a second document arrived. One that made the first look insignificant. One that connected dots the palace thought were buried. One that made even the most seasoned royal advisors exchange uneasy glances. And at the end of that second document was the single name that terrified Buckingham Palace. And at the end of that second document was the single name that terrified Buckingham Palace. What name could possibly carry that kind of weight? What name could send a jolt of panic through an institution that has weathered wars, abdications, assassinations, divorces, deaths, and decades-long scandals? What could make the king's blood run cold in a way that no tabloid headline could? That's the question, isn't it? Because when Charles reached that final line, when his eyes locked onto that signature, the signature of someone he never imagined would be pulled into the scandal, that was the moment he understood that this wasn't just Andrew's problem anymore. It was the monarchy's problem. It was the government's problem. It was his problem. And if he didn't act quickly, decisively, and ruthlessly, the fallout wouldn't just ruin Andrew's life. It would consume everything. The name was one Andrew should never have been in contact with, especially not recently, especially not secretly, especially not while under intense scrutiny from multiple international agencies. But there it was, a name tied to sensitive investigations, a name associated with legal proceedings that were still ongoing, a name the palace had been warned to avoid at all costs. Andrew had crossed a line, and for the first time, Charles realized that the line wasn't just thin, it was electrified. When Charles looked up at the aide, the room felt smaller, tighter, heavily pressurized. And you know when someone tries to speak, but the words don't come out because their mind is racing faster than their mouth can? That's what happened to Charles. He opened his mouth twice before anything came out. Finally, he managed 5 words that struck the aide like a blow. This cannot continue any longer. But here's where the emotional contradiction intensifies. Because even as Charles felt fear, real fear, he also felt grief. Deep, unexpected grief. Not because of Andrew's downfall, but because of what that downfall represented. A failure. A personal failure. A family failure. A legacy crack too big to patch. Imagine being king for less than a year and learning that the institution you waited a lifetime to lead was on the brink of destruction because of your own flesh and blood. How do you even process that? How do you breathe through it? Charles wasn't angry at first. He was devastated. The aide, sensing the gravity of the moment, didn't speak. He simply handed Charles the second envelope, a slim, sealed one, and stepped back. Charles hesitated before opening it, almost as if he knew whatever was inside would make everything 10 times worse. And he was right, because inside that envelope was a transcript. A transcript of a phone call Andrew had made recently. A call he should never have made. A call that had been flagged, intercepted, and passed through international channels before landing directly in the hands of palace security. A call that raised one question so urgent, Scotland Yard had already taken notice. Why was Andrew contacting this individual? What was he trying to accomplish? And more importantly, who else was involved? Now pause with me for a second. Think about how you react when someone you trust surprises you in the worst possible way. When a person you've defended suddenly does something reckless, dangerous, or self-destructive. That sinking feeling in your stomach? That disbelief? That's exactly what Charles felt, multiplied by the weight of an entire kingdom. Because the phone call wasn't casual. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't misinterpreted. It was intentional, deliberate, calculated. And whether Andrew realized it or not, it was the moment the palace lost any remaining justification for protecting him. The transcript revealed 3 things. 1. Andrew was in communication with individuals overseas who were directly relevant to ongoing investigations. 2. He referenced his situation in ways that suggested he was strategizing, not cooperating. 3. He implied he still had royal leverage, a statement that horrified palace lawyers. Charles read the transcript twice, 3 times. 4. With each pass, his face hardened. Gone was the grief. Gone was the hesitation. What replaced it was something far colder, a new understanding that his brother could not be managed, could not be reasoned with, could not be trusted. And that's when something shifted inside Charles. A switch, a kingly instinct, perhaps, the realization that compassion had become a liability. He summoned 2 of his closest advisors immediately, the same advisors who handled the aftermath of the Newsnight disaster. They arrived within minutes, having been told only that the matter was urgent. When Charles placed the documents on the table, neither advisor spoke for nearly 10 seconds. That silence said more than any report ever could. Finally, the senior advisor, a man known for his icy composure, asked, "Has anyone else seen this?" "No," Charles replied, "and no one else can." Then came the question no king ever wants to answer. "Your Majesty, what do you intend to do?" Charles closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the man who had spent decades as the waiting heir, the substitute, the understudy, was gone. Sitting in his place was the king. "Everything," he said quietly. "Everything necessary." Now here's where the tension spikes. Because up until this point, Andrew's downfall was slow, messy, embarrassing, but manageable. This was the moment it became unmanageable. This was the moment the palace understood they were no longer dealing with a fallen prince seeking redemption. They were dealing with a man whose actions posed a threat. And threats require action. From that moment forward, the royal household began operating in a completely different way. Meetings were rearranged. Communications were tightened. Security protocols were updated. Senior staff were told to be alert and discreet. The atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace changed overnight. People spoke in shorter sentences, walked with more urgency, avoided eye contact in the hallways. Because when a crisis becomes internal, when the danger is coming from inside the monarchy itself, the level of secrecy becomes extreme. But this is where an unexpected twist enters the story, and you didn't hear this part from the media. Because while the palace was scrambling internally, Andrew was behaving as if nothing were wrong. He still demanded staff, still requested chauffeurs, still ordered meals at odd hours, still insisted on meetings with individuals he had no business contacting. It was as if he believed he could simply ride out the storm, as if centuries of royal privilege had convinced him he was untouchable. And that contrast, the palace in panic versus Andrew in denial, is the contradiction that pushed the crisis into freefall. Even staff who had once defended him began whispering, "Why isn't he taking this seriously?" One footman described Andrew's behavior as a man rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Then came the moment that accelerated the fall from grace. Andrew's unannounced arrival at Windsor, demanding a private meeting with Charles. No appointment, no warning, no protocol. He simply appeared at the doors of the king's study, insisting he be let in. The staff panicked. The security officers froze. And for a brief moment, palace protocol broke down completely. Charles agreed to see him. What happened behind that closed door remains one of the most intense confrontations in modern royal history. Raised voices, long silences, emotional pleas, accusations, denials. At one point, Andrew reportedly said something that made Charles go still, not angry, not upset, but still. And when Charles becomes still, insiders say, that's when he is most dangerous. The meeting ended abruptly. Andrew stormed out. Charles remained seated, hands clasped tightly. Minutes later, he made the call that would change everything. But what exactly did Andrew say? Why did it affect Charles so deeply? And what decision did Charles make immediately afterward? Because the moment Andrew walked out of that room, the machinery of the monarchy shifted into motion, and the fall from grace became irreversible. I will stop here to stay within your rules. What if the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones shouted in public, but the ones delivered in plain envelopes? What if the moment the monarchy truly realized it was in danger didn't happen in front of cameras or reporters or world leaders, but in a silent room, under dim lights, with the soft sound of paper sliding across a polished table. Because that's exactly how Chapter 2 begins. With a dossier. A thick, sealed, urgent dossier. And the question I want to ask you is simple. How much truth can one man handle before everything he knows begins to crumble? Pick up the thread with me, right where we left off. Andrew storming out of Charles's study, face flushed, breath sharp, muttering under his breath about loyalty, betrayal, misunderstanding, and what the family owes me. Meanwhile, Charles remained seated, elbows on the desk, fingers pressed hard against his temples. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak. His aides waited outside the room, terrified of knocking, terrified of interrupting, terrified of what might happen next. Because they'd seen that look before, once, years ago, during the darkest days after Diana's death. The look of a man who realized the control he believed he had was slipping away. But what Charles didn't know, not yet, was that the confrontation with Andrew wasn't even the real turning point. The real turning point was coming from somewhere else, from someone else. And it would arrive in the form of a dossier so damning, so detailed, so meticulously compiled that even the most seasoned palace officials would freeze when they saw it. It began early the next morning. The palace was unusually quiet. Even the staff walked softer, as if afraid to disturb the fragile calm settling over Buckingham. Charles had barely slept, replaying Andrew's words again and again. But before he could even begin processing the emotional weight of the previous night, there was a sharp knock at the door. Not frantic, not hesitant. A precise, controlled knock. The kind of knock that meant business. It was the king's private secretary, a man who never disturbed Charles without reason. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice unusually tight. "We have received something. It's urgent. An envelope. Thick. Sealed with the crest of an intelligence liaison. Not MI5, not MI6. But a specialized intergovernmental channel used only for matters where national risk intersects with international legal proceedings. A channel most monarchs never hear from directly. A channel Charles hoped he would never hear from. He opened the envelope. Inside, a dossier. Thick. Heavy. Marked internal, priority classification, immediate. Charles glanced at the first page, and everything around him seemed to slow. Because this wasn't a compilation of rumors. This wasn't a rehash of old scandals. This wasn't a tabloid's greatest hits. This was a chronological, evidence-supported, cross-referenced timeline of Andrew's activities, movements, communications, financial entries, overseas visits, unexplained meetings, stretching back far longer than Charles expected, prepared with a thoroughness that bordered on surgical. And that was just the beginning. Let's walk through what the dossier revealed. Not the legal details, not the sensitive information, but the emotional truth behind it. The kind of truth that hits harder than evidence ever could. Because the first contradiction the dossier exposed was this. Andrew said he had cut all ties, but the timeline said otherwise. Andrew said he had cooperated fully, but the dossier suggested hesitations, inconsistencies, unexplained delays. Andrew said he was misunderstood, but the documents implied he had misrepresented key events. Not necessarily criminal, but deeply concerning for someone of his position. Every contradiction was a blow, not just to the monarchy's reputation, but to Charles personally. Imagine reading a list of moments where your own sibling misled you, even unintentionally. Imagine realizing you had defended someone based on incomplete information. Imagine discovering things you should have been told long ago. And you, watching this, let me ask you something directly. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that you didn't question them, only to find out later they weren't telling you the full truth? That sting? That shock? Multiply it by decades of royal pressure and the responsibility of an entire nation. That's what Charles felt as he turned each page. But the part that made his hands tremble wasn't the timeline. It was the annotations. Several entries had been circled, highlighted, flagged. These were not mere mistakes or oversights. These were moments that investigators found concerning enough to escalate. Charles leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he read the flagged items again. And then again, because the implications, even without concrete conclusions, were enough to send a chill through the palace. One entry in particular was marked with a red tab. A meeting, a date, a location, an individual whose name was under confidentiality restrictions. Charles whispered, "This can't be right." The private secretary said nothing. But here's where the story twists, because the dossier didn't stop at timelines or meetings. It included something no one expected: third-party testimony. People from Andrew's orbit, staff, associates, individuals who had been silently watching patterns that no outsider could detect. Their statements weren't accusations. They were observations. And sometimes, observations are far more powerful than allegations. One line stood out so sharply that palace insiders still reference it today. He believes he is untouchable. That sentence, just 5 words, hit Charles harder than any legal implication, because it confirmed what he had feared during the confrontation the night before. Not only was Andrew detached from reality, he was operating in a world where consequences didn't apply. And that mindset, that disconnect, that arrogance, that's what transforms a scandal into a crisis. But the emotional blow wasn't the worst part. The worst part came near the end of the dossier, the section marked restricted access. Inside was a cross-border correspondence log, communications flagged by international contacts, notes about Andrew attempting to reach individuals the palace had explicitly warned him to avoid. Charles pushed his chair back. He stood up. He walked to the window, shoulders heaving. And then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "He's going to bring the entire monarchy down with him." Think about that. The King of England, looking at evidence that his own brother, through carelessness, arrogance, desperation, or all three, posed a threat to the crown itself. Now let me ask you this. What would you do in that moment? Protect your brother or protect your country? Because that's the crossroads Charles had reached. And the decision he would make next would shape the entire trajectory of this story. But the dossier held one more secret. At the very end, after the timelines, the observations, the flagged communications, there was an addendum, a sealed addendum, a final note that intelligence officers insisted be opened only by the king himself. Charles opened it. He read it once, and the color drained from his face. What was in that addendum? What revelation could unnerve a man who had prepared his whole life for crisis? What secret was so sensitive it had to be delivered in a sealed compartment separate from the rest? Because whatever it was, that was the moment Buckingham Palace realized the situation was spiraling into territory far beyond their control. And that single revelation would lead to the next, more shocking phase of the crisis. The phase where the palace staff themselves began to revolt. The phase where loyalty was no longer guaranteed. The phase where silence turned to whispers. And whispers turned to rebellion. What happens when the people who are paid to protect the monarchy stop protecting it? What happens when the staff, the invisible hands that keep the palace running, the keepers of protocol, the ones who see everything, begin to question whether the royal family deserves their loyalty? Because that's exactly what happened next. And it's one of the most dangerous things that can occur inside Buckingham Palace. Not protests, not politicians, not tabloids, but something far quieter, far slower, far deadlier, a revolt from within. Let's pick up directly from the cliffhanger, that sealed addendum in the dossier, the moment the king's face went pale. Charles didn't speak for nearly a full minute. His private secretary stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or leave. The palace clock ticked loudly in the silence. And when Charles finally moved, he didn't sit. He didn't pace. He simply stood beside his desk, staring at the papers as if they were radioactive. Because to him, they were. But the most dangerous thing that came from that addendum wasn't the information itself. It was the realization that the crisis was larger than anyone thought. It reached deeper, spread wider. The palace wasn't dealing with a contained scandal. They were dealing with something that had infiltrated the royal structure so thoroughly that even the staff could sense the tension. And trust me, when the staff sense something, the foundation shakes. Because royal staff are trained for storms. They're trained for deaths, for coronations, for constitutional crises, for media frenzies, for divorces, for scandals, for unpredictable behavior from emotionally unstable royals. They've seen everything. But this was different. Within hours of Charles reading the addendum, a ripple moved through Buckingham Palace. Not because the staff knew the details, they didn't. They didn't need to. They could feel it. The king's tone shifted. His steps grew heavier. His requests became clipped, urgent, direct. That kind of shift, that sudden tightening of royal protocol, is a signal, a warning siren without sound. and the staff responded. At first, it was simple things. A few senior aides exchanged uneasy looks. A security officer double-checked his schedule. The housekeeping coordinator whispered to her deputy, "Something's coming." But within a day, whispers turned into conversations. Conversations turned into rumors. Rumors turned into quiet rebellion. Because palace staff weren't just worried about Andrew. They were worried about themselves. How close were they to the fallout? Would they be blamed? Would they be questioned? Would they lose their jobs? Would their careers end because they worked too close to the blast radius? This is where the story takes a sharp emotional turn, because for the first time, staff members, especially senior ones, began to speak openly about refusing Andrew's requests, refusing to drive him, refusing to schedule his appointments, refusing to manage his guests, refusing to shield him from consequences. That is unheard of in royal history. Staff are trained to obey, to defer, to avoid conflict. But slowly, one by one, people began to say what they had never said aloud. "I'm not covering for him anymore. Let me ask you something. What would you do if your entire workplace was built on loyalty, but that loyalty suddenly felt like a threat to your integrity? Would you keep quiet? Or would you finally speak up?" Because the staff chose to speak. One advisor quietly pulled another into a hallway and muttered, "We're risking our reputations for a man who won't even protect his own." Another, normally stoic, confessed to colleagues that she was deeply uncomfortable being associated with anything involving Andrew. You could feel the shift in the air, a tightening, a snapping point, where silence turned into resistance. Then came the moment that made the revolt undeniable. Andrew issued a demand. A simple one, in his mind. He wanted access to a private communication suite located in a restricted part of the palace. Something he should never have been anywhere near. Something intended for senior royals on official state business. And he wanted it immediately. In the past, staff would have nodded, apologized, and accommodated him. Not this time. A senior communications officer said, "I'm afraid that won't be possible, sir." Andrew froze. No one had said no to him like that in decades. "What do you mean, impossible?" he snapped. "It's restricted," the officer replied, calm but firm. "It's never been restricted for me. It is now." Those 3 words. "It is now," were a declaration of revolt. A line drawn by palace staff who had had enough. Andrew, stunned, demanded to speak to someone with real authority. But here's the twist. That officer did have real authority. Authority Charles himself had quietly expanded behind the scenes after reading the dossier. Andrew tried pushing past the officer. Security stepped in. They didn't touch him. They would never do that. But they positioned themselves in a way that made the message clear. You can no longer do whatever you want. Andrew left in a fury. And within an hour, something extraordinary happened. 3 senior staff members, each working in different departments, independently went to the king's private secretary to express the same concern. "We cannot continue supporting him. Not under the current circumstances. Staff revolts don't happen in the royal household. It's not part of the culture. The structure is rigid, almost militaristic. Orders flow downward. Obedience flows upward. The idea of saying no to a royal is practically sacrilegious." But it was happening. And the backlash wasn't limited to Buckingham Palace. At Windsor, staff at Royal Lodge were also pushing back. Some refused to sign for packages. Others asked to be reassigned. One long-serving housekeeper confided to her colleague, "If something happens, I don't want my name anywhere near this." The walls were closing in on Andrew. Not because the public turned on him, but because the people closest to him were finally turning away. But the revolt became unmistakable when a senior royal aide, one of the most loyal, discreet, tight-lipped professionals in the entire palace, requested a private meeting with Charles. This aide had served through the Diana years, the Queen's passing, the Sussex drama, political chaos, and a dozen personal crises. He had never asked for a private meeting with a monarch, ever. Charles granted it immediately. The aide entered, closed the door, hesitated, and then spoke with a trembling voice. "Your Majesty, the household is reaching a breaking point." Charles's eyebrows lifted, not in surprise, but in resignation. He already knew. But hearing it confirmed by someone so loyal, so dependable, so unwavering, that's what made the decision real. The aide continued, "Sir, we cannot maintain stability while the Duke continues as he has. I believe more incidents are coming. The staff is frightened. They are ready to leave. Charles didn't answer right away. He looked out the window. He pressed his hands together. He inhaled slowly, sharply, because he knew what that meant. If the staff lost their loyalty, the monarchy lost its backbone. After all, royals can't function without their household. They can't protect themselves. They can't negotiate, plan, issue statements, organize events, or maintain any sense of structure without the people behind the scenes. A staff revolt isn't just inconvenient. It's catastrophic. And the biggest blow came when the royal security detail, the team tasked with protecting Andrew, filed a collective report expressing concerns about his recent behavior. Security officers never write reports like this unless absolutely necessary. It meant they felt something dangerous brewing. Charles read it. He put it down. He said 6 words that changed everything. Begin preparing the next phase immediately. But what was the next phase? What did Charles see coming that the staff didn't? What information from the dossier was he preparing for? Because the next phase wasn't about Andrew's reputation. It wasn't about his titles. It wasn't even about the palace revolt. It was about something far more serious. Something he knew was now inevitable. What happens when a royal scandal stops being a PR nightmare and becomes a legal one? What happens when the monarchy, an institution built on ceremony, symbolism, and centuries-old traditions, suddenly collides with the cold, clinical machinery of the law? Because that's exactly where we are now. And the moment it happened, the moment this crisis crossed the line from internal embarrassment to external threat, was the moment King Charles realized he was out of time. Let's pick up directly from the cliffhanger. Begin preparing the next phase immediately. Those 6 words weren't spoken lightly. They weren't a suggestion. They weren't a reaction. They were an order, the kind of order a king gives when he knows the safety net has vanished. Because Charles understood something the staff didn't. Something even Andrew didn't. He knew that the palace had received a warning. A very specific warning. And warnings from legal authorities, especially when they come in writing, are never subtle. The day after the staff revolt, Charles convened another emergency meeting. Not with advisors. Not with communications staff. Not with the household. This time, he summoned the palace's legal team. The ones who rarely appear in public. The ones who operate behind layers of confidentiality. The ones who only surface when the stakes are life or death for the monarchy's reputation. The legal team did not arrive casually. They walked in with files under their arms, expressions tight, back straight. They were prepared. And when palace lawyers are prepared, it means trouble. Charles sat at the head of the long mahogany table. The atmosphere was so tense that even the ticking of the antique clock felt intrusive. The lead counsel cleared his throat, opened a folder, and began with a sentence that made the entire room freeze. Your Majesty, we must address the legal risk immediately. Legal risk. Not public risk. Not reputational risk. Not political risk. Legal risk. Let me ask you something directly. Have you ever experienced the moment when a problem stops being emotional and suddenly becomes tangible, measurable, something with consequences you can't talk your way out of? The moment you move from arguments to paperwork? That's exactly what Charles was witnessing now. The moment the scandal transformed from a family crisis into something the law could sink its teeth into. The lawyer continued. We have received inquiries from several international jurisdictions. Some formal, some informal, some requesting clarification, some requesting access to communications. The table fell silent. Because inquiries, especially international ones, are not optional. They are not friendly suggestions. They are the beginning of a legal timeline that cannot be ignored. Another lawyer spoke, her voice quieter but firmer. In addition to that, Your Majesty, certain organizations within the UK have expressed concern about the Crown appearing uncooperative. There is a real risk that parliamentary committees may begin to question royal transparency if we do not act decisively. The implication was devastating. If the monarchy appeared to be shielding Andrew, even unintentionally, it could trigger political intervention. Charles leaned forward, clasping his hands together. Are you saying Parliament may involve itself? He asked. The lead lawyer hesitated for one brief, pregnant second. Yes, sir. Parliament. Intervening in a royal scandal. That has not happened in generations. For Charles, the weight of that possibility was suffocating. Because Parliament stepping in meant one thing: the monarchy losing control of its own narrative. But the legal team wasn't done. The next file was placed on the table. Another dossier. Then another. Then another. This wasn't speculation anymore. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't the palace preparing for hypotheticals. This was the legal machinery activating its engines. One lawyer flipped open a folder. Your Majesty, multiple military organizations have now filed formal statements distancing themselves from the Duke, she said. If we fail to respond appropriately, we could face legal scrutiny regarding his continued use of certain titles. Another added. And if we do not act, Your Majesty, there is a possibility, not guaranteed, but possible, that external authorities may attempt to compel cooperation through formal channels. Think about that for a moment. Authorities compelling the monarchy to cooperate. That's the kind of constitutional tension that makes headlines for decades. But then came the moment that truly shifted the ground beneath the king. A senior advisor, one known for being blunt to the point of brutality, spoke clearly. There is no longer a scenario where doing nothing is viable. Those words hung in the air like a guillotine. No longer viable. No longer optional. No longer defensible. And Charles knew it. Because you can defend a brother. You can defend a royal. You can defend a scandal. But you cannot defend a legal threat. Now, let me ask you, what would you do in this moment? Protect your blood? Or protect your throne? Because Charles made his decision. He asked the legal team a question that revealed he had crossed the threshold. What is the safest course of action for the monarchy? Not for Andrew. Not for the family. Not for public opinion. For the monarchy. The lawyers exchanged glances, and the lead counsel responded. Remove all remaining royal privileges. End the ambiguity. Create legal distance. And do it quickly. Legal distance. A phrase that sounds harmless, but in royal terms, it might as well be a severing of limbs. The lawyer continued. Your Majesty, as long as the Duke retains his titles, his residence, his privileges, and his protections, the monarchy is legally entangled. That entanglement exposes the crown to unnecessary risk. Translation: as long as Andrew had anything, the monarchy could be blamed for everything. This wasn't about guilt or innocence. This was about liability. Charles nodded slowly. He understood. This was the moment the eviction became inevitable. The moment the stripping of titles became unavoidable. The moment Andrew's downfall became a matter of legal necessity, not royal preference. But then came the biggest blow. One lawyer, usually reserved, rarely emotional, leaned forward and spoke almost apologetically. Your Majesty, Scotland Yard has also reached out. Privately. Charles inhaled sharply. What did they say? They have questions, sir. And they would like clarification on the Duke's recent activities. The room went still. Scotland Yard. Contacting the monarchy. Privately. Not through official government channels. This was no longer about reputation. This was about investigation. Another lawyer added. And, Your Majesty, if the inquiries escalate, the crown must not appear complicit. Complicit. A word with nuclear implications. And Charles knew instantly what that meant. If he didn't act now, the monarchy could be dragged into the legal arena, not as a witness, but as a participant. And then came the sentence that made Charles sit back as if struck. If His Royal Highness continues to refuse cooperation, he may leave authorities with no choice but to escalate. Escalate? Charles asked. The lawyer hesitated. Yes, sir. To what extent? Another long pause. To the extent of initiating formal action. Formal action. Those two words ripped through the room like lightning. Because formal action means one thing. Arrest wasn't off the table. Even the lawyers understood the gravity. One of them finally said, We are not asserting this will happen. Only that it could. But the damage was done. Charles exhaled slowly, shoulders trembling. He stared at the table silently. Everyone else remained motionless, as if afraid any movement would break the fragile balance of the room. Then Charles said something he had never said before. I need to protect the crown, even if it means sacrificing my brother. Everything changed in that moment. The lawyers closed their files. The aide stepped back. The decision was sealed. But the legal threat had one more twist, one that would come later that evening, delivered in a briefcase to the palace gates. Something so shocking, so unexpected, that even the king's most experienced advisors couldn't hide their alarm. Because when a monarchy is under legal threat, evidence matters. And what arrived next wasn't a warning. It was evidence. Evidence that would force Charles to act faster than he ever imagined. And what came after that? That's where the crisis truly exploded. What if the past you thought was buried suddenly claws its way back into the present? What if the one connection you believed time would erase, or at least quiet, returns with new force, new witnesses, new timelines, new evidence, and a new urgency that no palace PR machine can bury? Because that's exactly what happened next. And it was this moment, the resurfacing of old Epstein links, but with new context, that shifted the entire crisis from dangerous to catastrophic. Let's pick up directly from the cliffhanger. Evidence had arrived. Not rumors, not speculation, not newspaper cuttings. Evidence. And that evidence reignited the most volatile part of Andrew's history, the one link the palace had prayed would never resurface: Jeffrey Epstein. But this time, the resemblance to past scandals was superficial. The reality was far worse. Because the new information wasn't about what we already knew: the parties, the photo, the friendships, the interviews. It was about new timelines that didn't match certain public statements. It was about movements that contradicted established narratives. It was about small details, previously overlooked, that gained disturbing significance when placed side by side. And here's how the crisis erupted. The morning after the legal team's warning, Charles received another sealed packet, this time delivered through a confidential liaison, not by palace staff. It was placed directly in his hands. No intermediaries. No aides. No delay. Inside were 3 documents. 3, each more devastating than the last. The first document was a reanalysis of Epstein's travel records, cross-referenced with Andrew's publicly known schedule. Nothing new at first glance. But halfway down the page, something unusual appeared. A date that had previously been dismissed as irrelevant. A date that now resurfaced with corroborating evidence from a third-party source. The second document was a statement, not an accusation, not a testimony intended for court. A statement from an individual who had recently come forward, someone who had never spoken publicly, someone whose name was kept confidential even within the file. Their account wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sensational. It was calm, measured, factual, and deeply unsettling. Because their recollections contradicted a key detail Andrew had insisted on for years. Contradictions are dangerous. Contradictions resurrect scandals. Contradictions turn old stories into new investigations. The third document was the most alarming. A private analysis prepared by international authorities indicating that, due to inconsistencies, certain timelines might need to be re-examined. Re-examined. That word alone was enough to send Buckingham Palace into internal panic. Let me ask you something directly. Have you ever tried to move on from something? Truly move on? Only to have the past reappear in a way that makes it impossible to ignore? That feeling of dread? That sinking heaviness in your chest? That was the energy inside the palace. Except this wasn't a personal mistake resurfacing. This was a global scandal waking from its dormant state. Charles sat with the documents for nearly an hour, reading them again and again, until the lines blurred and the weight of the paper felt 100 pounds heavier. His private secretary hovered outside the door, knowing better than to interrupt. When Charles finally emerged, his expression wasn't angry. It wasn't shocked. It was something far worse. Resigned. As if the universe had just confirmed what he had feared all along. That the crisis wasn't going to fade. That there would be no easy exit. That the monarchy was stepping into deeper waters than even the Queen ever had to navigate. But the true explosion came later that afternoon, when a journalist, a persistent investigative reporter from a major outlet, published a short but cryptic thread online. It wasn't explicit. It wasn't accusatory. It simply said, "New details may soon emerge regarding old timelines. Watch this space." That was it. Just enough to stir speculation. Just enough to hint at movement. Just enough to terrify the palace. Within minutes, phones were buzzing. Aides were racing through the corridors. Communications staff were whispering frantically in back offices. And Charles realized something dreadful. The press somehow knew. They didn't know everything, but they knew something. And in crises like this, something is more dangerous than everything. Because everything can be planned for. Something is unpredictable. Now let's zoom into the emotional heart of this chapter. Because this wasn't just a political or legal crisis. It was personal. Deeply personal. Charles had always believed, or at least hoped, that Andrew's involvement with Epstein had ended with the Newsnight fiasco, the settlement, and the stripping of duties. But this new evidence suggested the story wasn't closed. Not in the eyes of investigators. Not in the eyes of intelligence bodies. Not in the eyes of journalists. The fear wasn't merely that Andrew had lied. The fear was that Andrew didn't understand what he had done. The fear was that Andrew believed he could still talk his way out of this. The fear was that he remained dangerously unaware of how serious the situation had become. Later that evening, Charles summoned one of the few advisors he trusted completely, someone who had handled crises for decades, someone who had survived the Diana era, the phone hacking scandals, the early Harry-Meghan tensions, and every major royal disaster in recent memory. When Charles handed him the documents, the advisor closed the door, sat down, and read in silence. When he finished, he didn't look up. He didn't ask a question. He didn't offer reassurance. He simply said, "Your Majesty, this cannot stay inside the palace any longer." Those words hit Charles like a cold blast of wind, because he knew exactly what they meant. He asked, "What are you suggesting?" The advisor took a breath and replied, "We must involve external authorities properly, before they involve themselves." This was the nightmare scenario, because once the monarchy initiates formal cooperation with investigators, everything changes. The tone changes. The stakes change. The public perception changes. And the distance between Andrew and the crown becomes not optional, but mandatory. Charles nodded slowly, in painful understanding. But before any action could be taken, before the palace could issue a statement, before the legal team could prepare briefing notes, before official channels could be contacted, something else happened. Something no one expected. Something that made everything exponentially worse. One of the confidential witnesses, the one whose statement was in the third document, contacted authorities again, not with accusations, but with an additional clarification. A clarification that widened the timeline even further, adding another layer of complexity, another crack in the palace narrative, another reason for investigators to dig deeper. And as if on cue, a former Epstein associate, someone known for giving strategic interviews, made a vague but ominous comment in a televised documentary. There were people Epstein stayed in touch with longer than anyone realized. Journalists pounced. Social media erupted. Theories multiplied. The palace phone lines lit up like a Christmas tree. Now let me ask you, how do you stop a story once it becomes a wildfire? How do you outrun a narrative that keeps regenerating itself? Because the resurfaced Epstein link didn't just damage Andrew. It damaged the crown. It damaged public trust. It damaged international perception. It raised questions no monarchy once asked. What did the palace know? When did they know it? And why didn't they act sooner? But while the public was only beginning to sense the tremors, inside the palace something else was happening. Something even more alarming. Because while Charles read the documents with dread, Andrew dismissed them. He claimed it was all coincidence, all misunderstanding, all misinterpretation, all media manipulation. He insisted the palace was overreacting, that investigators were exaggerating, that the documents were taken out of context. And that contradiction, Andrew in denial while the monarchy panicked, triggered the next escalation. Because when someone refuses to take responsibility, the people around them must. And the next people forced to take responsibility were the investigators themselves. Because as the palace scrambled to contain the fallout, a new request landed on the king's desk, this time from Scotland Yard. A written request, not for cooperation, not for statements, not for meetings, but for access. Access to specific individuals. Access to specific records. Access to specific timelines. It was the moment Charles feared most. The moment the legal threat became a legal reality. But what exactly did Scotland Yard request? Why did this new request force Charles to act faster than ever? And what happened inside the palace the night that letter arrived? Because that night, everything changed, and the crisis moved from deeply concerning to impossible to contain. I will pause here to stay within your continuation rules. What happens when the people who are paid to protect the monarchy stop protecting it? What happens when the staff, the invisible hands that keep the palace running, the keepers of protocol, the ones who see everything, begin to question whether the royal family deserves their loyalty? Because that's exactly what happened next. And it's one of the most dangerous things that can occur inside Buckingham Palace. Not protests, not politicians, not tabloids, but something far quieter, far slower, far deadlier, a revolt from within. Let's pick up directly from the cliffhanger that sealed addendum in the dossier. The moment the king's face went pale, Charles didn't speak for nearly a full minute. His private secretary stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or leave. The palace clock ticked loudly in the silence. And when Charles finally moved, he didn't sit. He didn't pace.